Welcome to the Scientific Sense podcast, where we explore emerging ideas from science, policy, economics, and technology. My name is Gil Epen. We talk with world's leading academics and experts about their recent research or general areas of topical interest. Scientific Sense is an unstructured conversation with no agenda or preparation. We cover a wide variety of domains where new discoveries are made and new technologies are developed on a daily basis. We are most interested in how new ideas affect society and help educate the world how to pursue a rewarding and enjoyable life rooted in science, logic, and information. We seek knowledge without boundaries or constraints and provide unedited content of conversations with researchers and leaders who love what they do. A companion blog to this podcast can be found at scientificsense.com, and this podcast is available on over a dozen platforms and directly at scientificsense.net. If you have suggestions for topics, guests, and other ideas, please send them to info@scientificsense.com, and I can be reached at gil@epen.info. My guest today is Professor Carol Gould, who is the Professor of Philosophy at Florida Atlantic University, where she teaches primarily aesthetics, philosophy of psychiatry, and ancient Greek philosophy, areas in which she publishes widely. Many of her recent publications concern the relation between aesthetics, ethics, and personhood. She is currently completing a book manuscript on True Glamour, an unexplored topic in philosophy that stands at the intersection of aesthetics, ethics, and philosophy of psychiatry. Welcome, Carol.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be with you, Gil.
Thank you.
For inviting me.
Before we start, I have to warn you, Carol, I can pretend to know many things, but philosophy is not one of them. So you may find me spontaneously crumbling into scientific thoughts, and you may have to bring me back, like saving somebody from drowning in unfamiliar waters. More generally, I have nourished the left side of my brain for 40 years, and now I can begin to hear gentle objections from the right. And so this would be quite therapeutic in many ways for me. Having said that, I want to start with one of your earlier papers entitled Towards the Theory of the Aesthetic Properties of Persons.
Oh, okay.
And in this article, you argue that aesthetics needs to include a theory of the aesthetic properties of persons, which should be an important theme in the study of everyday aesthetics. Traditionally, aesthetic theorists have assumed that aesthetic properties can be predicated off artworks and natural things. And the article argues that persons, not merely their bodies, have aesthetic properties, and that aesthetic properties of persons require a different ontological analysis. And you say some examples are of aesthetic properties are glamour, grace of manner, magnetism, charm, and wit. You want to set the stage for the theory of aesthetic properties of persons?
Certainly. I will mention one other thing, though, that another aspect in aesthetics, another type of thing to which aesthetic properties have been ascribed are mathematical proofs, logical systems,
right,
scientific theories or theorems, and
even formulas. Some formulas,
formulas.
Yeah.
Yes, and I've been told by mathematicians, because I have, of course, as a philosopher, I have a background in logic, and have had discussions with mathematicians about this. That sometimes the deciding force between two competing proofs will be an aesthetic one.
Mm-hmm.
Elegance, for example, in a theory.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so, it seems that persons have been ignored. And I'm not speaking, I mean, certainly human bodies, especially right now, it's widely discussed, and people, will talk about, how, beauty of persons, that's one thing. And in the Asian tradition,
Yeah.
much more of an emphasis on this, the connection between certain aspects of the human psyche and their character, their human behavior and character, and the aesthetic element to that. But until very recently, people have not even focused on the body. I mean, except for, well, in terms of the way it's reflected in art, like the proportions, the Greeks with their golden ratio, etc. Well, we too hold that. So, but yes, I mean, a person is an embodied being. I mean,
Yeah.
there's a psyche as well as behavior, and we do have ethical properties, and we also have, however, in my opinion, aesthetic properties. And to say otherwise, I think, is to have a very limited concept of the aesthetic. And by aesthetic, we have, it deals with questions of art and beauty, and also, well, value judgments that are related to that, because you can have negative aesthetic properties as well.
Right.
But when we consider the complexity of being a person or of defining personhood, which is something I was doing in that article, and am actually revising now for this book I'm writing, that we see, for example, we do have agency, we have certain abilities to create our characters and our lives.
Yeah.
At least some would say. I mean, there is a concept called moral luck, and there's a taxonomy of moral luck. And so some people would say, well, we really don't have that kind of capacity for self-actualization because of our environment in which we were nurtured or not nurtured, or, and so forth, other environmental factors or genetic factors and so forth. There's some people, for example, who are born, with basically the kind of itinerary, pre-written itinerary to become an antisocial personality.
Right.
It is true. I mean, that these things do happen, unfortunately.
So Carol, when you say aesthetic properties, it's sort of a larger set. Are you saying it's a larger set of properties that could be attributed to a person? Because we know what is generally meant by, let's say, moral or psychological or social properties of a human being. Whereas aesthetic properties is a broader set of characteristics, right?
Well, I would say, I don't know if it's broader.
Okay.
I think that no, I don't think so. I think that, our aesthetic reactions to things seem to be a kind of, I was going to say primitive concept, but that could be taken in the wrong way, ambiguous. But in the sense that, there's a certain self-evidence to it, that we react to things not just in terms of morality or in terms of descriptive, but, there are values we place on things, and they're not only ethical. They have to do with a certain satisfaction or dissatisfaction that we take in observing them.
Yeah.
And, for example, when we observe, say, a painting by Cézanne, whom I happen to like, or Picasso, we might have, we have a certain reaction. You can be absolutely overcome. I remember once going into the Frick Gallery in New York, and suddenly my eye caught a Vermeer painting called Mistress and Maid, and my breath was taken away. I mean, it just captivated me for hours. And what was I responding to? I mean, well, okay, you could say I was responding to the qualities of light. I was looking at how did he do this? And of course, you can't quite pin it down. But there are things which cannot be reduced to purely factual properties.
Yeah.
It's the same thing when we have, to put it in, perhaps more everyday terms. We might listen to someone's performance. We might listen to two performances by equally talented and well-trained musicians, okay? Two who are equally adept technically, and yet one has something that the other doesn't. And it isn't just style, it's not just intonation, it's not, it's not technique, but there's something that we get to that's basic that we can't define further. And it's an evaluative concept. It's just as we sometimes see a person performing an action that clearly our reaction to it goes way beyond the descriptive.
Right.
Would you agree? Okay.
Yeah. So
it's self-evident. I mean, sometimes these things are self-evident.
Yeah.
And many people deny the existence of aesthetic properties for two reasons. One is that they want to deny the fact-value distinction. And the other is that they don't believe in metaphysically in properties. They're what would be called nominalists,
Right.
or relativists, or well, the pragmatic tradition, would say that this is just a category through our way we happen to articulate our perceptions, but they aren't real. So these would be reasons for denying aesthetic properties, speaking very generally. I mean, the literature is vast, as you can imagine, especially since the mid-20th century.
Yeah.
But so then you get to accepting properties, but then many people who are realists about properties, as opposed to relativists, say that aesthetic properties are fictions. Now, I think that something like beauty, or something like verbal dexterity, something, things like wit.
Right.
These are things that we all recognize, and we also know that they can vary from culture to culture, just as moral judgments can.
Right.
But yet, the meanings, we all still understand what these terms mean.
Yeah. So you had you had mentioned that aesthetic properties of objects, and what you're arguing is that similarly there are aesthetic properties of persons, but persons also have bodies, and just like we attribute aesthetic properties to objects, we tend to attribute aesthetic properties to bodies, right? Which is probably clearer in this
Well,
context.
yes, and they can
Yeah.
be viewed as objects. We can
Right.
view them also with, we can point to their sense, we can point to the things that we perceive with our senses.
Yeah.
And they seem easier to grasp because of that. But when we look at the embodied person, of course, the embodied person can have subjective aesthetic reactions to the world, but that's different than others recognizing them, aesthetic properties in that person. Like we might appreciate a person's ability to view the world and experience the world aesthetically, but that's different than the person, the subjectivity of that person. And I think the fact that persons do have subjectivity, and which really is sort of the governing principle of my whole analysis as I'm reworking it now, because what you read was, just my original
Idea.
thoughts about it, doodling, you might say, which I'm now in. But the body is easy to what people today call objectify.
Right.
And what we consider that reprehensible when people are objectified. At least I would say that most people who are thoughtful about it, or who are kind and compassionate. We think about people who are viewed, and again, the literature on objectification is vast, especially since I would say the later part of the 20th century. Maybe it's the women's movement and other, identity politics and so forth. But, we look at, when we judge a person in terms of their body, and we don't look beyond that, that's a form of objectification, because we are looking at the person and judging the person or the body in the same way we might a painting or something we're looking at in nature. I'm looking out right now at the beach, and not because I'm at the beach, but because I'm looking out my window. I can see it from my window, and so it's beautiful because it's pretty much unpopulated in this particular area, and it's it's residential, but it's a fairly quiet area. It's not one of those crowded beaches that you see in the newspaper pictures of Florida.
Right. That's not allowed anymore.
Yes, right. The object lesson in evil behavior during this period of the COVID, not like that. And I see, it's really quite beautiful, the color of the water and so forth. But if I look at a human being and I say, oh, quite beautiful, look at the the fineness of the skin, or the proportions of the body, or etc., what people look at with bodies. But when we look at a person who say, there's some people whose bodies have a tautness to them. I mean, it doesn't matter what shape they are or size, but, it has to do with the way they move and so forth, or they might be graceful. And, that's something that is, I would say, the boundary of the physical and subjective. So, but, people, they're so different from objects. I mean, that's why we talk about morality. That's why we ascribe to people, goodness of character or lack thereof, or immaturity. We don't say that about an object, because objects, they change, but they cannot change from within. They don't have the agency to change themselves.
Yeah. So would you say, Carol, an aesthetic property of an object is more definable compared to an aesthetic property of a person? For example, talk about charisma as an aesthetic property. It is not really purely definable, right? It sort of emerges from the person.
Yes, that's right. And as you may have noticed, I think in my article, I talk about that. I talk about how these aesthetic properties emanate. And I think that we can see the effects, like something like charisma, which I've also been writing about and have written about. What's interesting about charisma that I think makes it different from glamour is that I would say it's an imposter of glamour. But charisma is something where a person has a certain passion that's infectious, and they have the ability to infect others with that. And so that what happens is that their passion becomes that of another.
Right.
But perhaps outside of the context, it's very contextualized. But outside of that context, it's simply the person might be totally undistinguished. I mean, nondescript. But when they're in a certain realm, say, and I can perhaps one example I think of very clearly are, well, there's certain musicians, whose passion for their instrument becomes almost as noteworthy as their performances. There's a famous cellist, you may have heard of, named Jacqueline Dupre, who she was a prodigy with a very short performance career because she became ill and died young, which gave her a certain interest, I suppose. But it's a kind of hypnotic power to influence people. I mean, I can't tell you how many cellists have claimed to have taken up the cello because they heard her play. And she, and even today, one hears that, and she hasn't played, I think, I want to say since the late 70s, but there was something about her playing that was absolutely infectious. You can't quite say what it is. You can't quite describe it. You can say that, she had a full sound. It was her interpretations were lovely. They were passionate. She had a capacity to play with great emotion. Technically, and actually, I watched a YouTube of her the other day, but I won't go off on that, except that I noticed that a lot of her technical modes of playing were things that cellists are usually told not to do when they're studying, with her bow hand and so forth. And I thought, it's interesting how she managed to execute some of these things so perfectly. And so charisma has this power to hypnotize others, to draw a kind of attention and fascination to what they are doing, to what fascinates them, what they're passionate about.
Right.
And you see that with teachers too, a charismatic teacher. And, if you're lucky in your life, you have one, at least one, and you become infected by their passion, and sometimes it changes your life.
Right.
Now, with glamour, on the other hand.
Yeah, let's dig a little deeper into it. So you had another paper, even earlier paper, Carol's, Glamour as an Aesthetic Property of Persons.
Yes.
Where you take a deep dive into glamour. So let's talk about that a bit. So you say that human relationships, people are attracted by various qualities in others: intellectual agility, ethical integrity, sexual magnetism, beauty, charisma, and glamour. And
Right.
some types of attraction involve a more inclusive appreciation of the individual as a complex, unique being. And so glamour, you argue, is sort of a personal quality. So define what you mean by glamour. And I know that you talk about, true glamour and false glamour as well. So lay down the foundation for what you mean by glamour.
Oh dear. Okay. Well, first of all, I think that in contrast to charisma, glamour doesn't arouse a passion for a pursuit or a subject area or a mode of knowledge. I think that, but it does inspire fascination in the person themselves. And it's, and I think that there's a certain subjective element to it that emanates, that the person emanates.
Yeah.
And that it has to do, again, with, and this is rather complex. It's what I'm writing on now and trying to work out in, detail. But I think that it has to do with a certain type of imagination that is projected. And the way I put it in that paper, as I recall, a long time ago, excuse me, but the way I put it and the way I'm working it out now is that it has to do with a person's ability to, or a person's tendency, let me say, to scan a realm of possibilities within their imagination. And we can't quite access it, but you sense that the person is doing it. And, people often identify glamour with mystery and so forth. It's a dark art. And, in fact, the word goes back to, well, actually, the evolution of the word is very complicated because and it has several roots, not just one. It's as complicated as the concept, actually. But this idea is that people become fascinated with the person because they can't grasp what that person is thinking or what the true nature of their responses. Now, anybody can conceal their responses to things, and can, I've seen people do it. I mean, we've all been in workplaces where people do it, and sometimes of necessity or for good pragmatic reasons. But there are others that where there's a certain residue of we could call it mystery, but I think that what it has to do with is I think it's a kind of adaptive strategy that some people have developed.
That's intentional.
Well, not intentional, no. I mean, I think that many of the strategies we develop as we navigate through life are not intentional. I think that some might be at the surface of consciousness, but they're not quite conscious.
So in this paper, you say, the term glamour is ambiguous, and you have noted iconic and seductive. So there could be, sort of two distinct ways these are two distinct types of glamours, so to speak, right?
Well, there's that, yes. I mean, when we think of glamour, we think of there's certain people who are iconically glamorous. And now, of course, in the age of the internet and social media, they've proliferated. But, and I hate to say it, but, if you think of if I ask some of my students, what glamour is, they will say, well, someone like Lady Gaga or
right.
And someone like that. And of course, this is a result of the incredible speed and just scope of our of the way we get information and images, and that's the kind of false glamour. So that's in a sense what I mean by false glamour. A person who can use a certain props, we might say, to construct an image. The person with true glamour is not constructing the image. It's a way of being in the world that's unintentional. Whether a person is conscious of it is not. They may, as they perhaps acquire more self-knowledge and maturity, and it's one danger of true glamour, but I think that perhaps the danger is that others project fantasies of that person, and that can have, in some cases, catastrophic consequences, but or inconvenient ones. In others, it's neutral in that respect in terms of its pragmatic value. I think though that it some people think it's about envy, and some people think that it didn't really exist until modernity, that it required a certain access of the many, with industrialization and the rise of cities and mass culture, that the notion of glamour, that's when the phenomenon of glamour appeared. But I think that it's always been there. I mean, I think that so affect, it's a certain, and that affect though emanates ultimately from the unconscious. Now, I think that when I say that it's something that one develops and without consciousness, you wouldn't say that a child is glamorous. It would seem actually somewhat of an abomination, it would, morally speaking, to describe a child that way. Would you agree?
Yes, I do. Yeah. So if I understand this correctly, Carol, so true glamour, as you say, is sort of an emerging property. False glamour, would you say there is it's a bit like the individual is trying to adapt to what he or she is finding in the environment, and using props and other stuff that you say to make it work. But what I also find very very clear in terms of definition is between charisma and glamour, right? Charisma and true glamour. So you say charismatic musician makes us feel the power and excitement of the music performed.
That's right.
Whereas a glamour, in contrast, impels us to try to understand its possessor rather than the person's motivating passion. So that's a very distinct difference between the two, right?
Yes, I mean that's everything. Well, I won't
Yeah.
say everything, but that's a major difference. And it can take different forms, just as charisma can. There are people, I mean, who you look at and you're fascinated right away. Sometimes the person speaks and you become fascinated, or doesn't speak. And so, yes, I think that's right. And in that article, I speak about, constructing a world and living in a world, because, somebody can sort of make themselves an artifact,
Yeah.
if you see what I mean. And other times, the person is just living a certain way, and they are, but you're not with one of the things about glamour is that you can't quite know entirely what it is that the world in which they're living, excuse me.
Yeah.
And I think that for certain personality types, it is a kind of adaptive strategy that people develop
Yeah, I
through
couldn't.
time, through the actualization of their their tendencies, their capacities, and you don't even have to know what realm of society, what stratum of society they're in, what profession or what they do, what their talents are. It's utterly different.
Yeah, when I was reading through your paper, Carol, I couldn't help thinking about politicians on national stage. I wouldn't mention any names. You have charismatic politicians. You have glamorous ones, both true and false,
Yeah.
In full display every day on TV. And so this may not be a hard concept for your students to understand.
No, I think that once it's perhaps analyzed,
Yeah.
it's people grasp it. I mean, people can, well, not everybody though agreed with me about that, but which perhaps was one of my motivations for writing it. But also because I think that it's simply an aspect of human life that's been ignored, and it's been ignored even at a time in philosophy when there's a powerful movement of what's called everyday aesthetics.
Yeah.
And this has emerged partly from globalization because, in many cultures, the aesthetics of just living from day to day are quite salient. Like in Japan, for example, Japanese aesthetics, where, they recognize the connection between life and aesthetic experience, and it's extremely important to them. But with today, with everyday aesthetics, and we have environmental aesthetics, so that's also part of it. But still, people think of glamour as somehow perhaps too vulgar, and I think it's because they're thinking of false glamour.
Right.
And there is this other phenomenon. So I'm not sure that it's easy to grasp. I'm not sure people really grasp.
Are we losing? Let me ask you this: if you do sort of a longitudinal study, my left brain is crying to kick back into this discussion. If you do some kind of a longitudinal study, Cal, would you say that true glamour is declining or being replaced by false glamour?
Well, actually, one of the chapters in my book is called The Eclipse of True Glamour and the Age of Social Media. So I would say yes, definitely, because it's concealed. And it also has a lot to do with the way we, contemporary society, with the internet and the globalized economy, both of which have had wonderful effects, but also nefarious.
Yeah.
And so I would say that yes, absolutely. We can't recognize it, first of all, because we're bombarded with images of false glamour. And even, even someone like me, I mean, I don't even, or I try not to spend too much time looking at such things, but they're unavoidable.
Yeah.
That our world. And also, I think that, there's been a lot of I think, very fruitful cross-fertilization amongst cultures that, has produced a lot of interesting styles in the arts and human life and interiors and, architecture and so forth. But I think that on a personal level, it's, it's made it very easy for people to adopt disguises. So I actually think that aside from the obvious problems with social media and the internet, some of the obvious ones, meaning that people scammed and people, get, spied upon and stalked, even worse. All of those things are a problem. But I think that, yes, I do think that false glamour has taken over. And I would never say that it's obliterated true glamour, but I do think it's concealed it and eclipsing it. I think that we're less likely to experience it. And the problem is that we're less likely to scrutinize other people in the same way and to experience them. I think that it's totally diluted our sense of the world and our sense of the human scene and our sense of the human being as other and as of a subjectivity that we want to explore and get to know, and a subject of fascination, which I think it always has been. I mean, if we look at literature and philosophy and even science, from throughout the history, I mean, that we see that that's something that has always been a subject of fascination, but it's becoming less so because the image is so much easier to absorb.
Yeah, it could also be a bias of our generation, possibly, right? So we sort of look back and say, this is how the world used to be. And there are certain properties, characteristics that we find comforting, but that's not the case for the next one. So I often wondered, the characteristics that we sort of try to impose may not be really applicable for the next generation.
Well, they might not be, but I think that what I think is that it's unfortunate because the pace at which they experience the world makes it harder for them to experience it deeply. And that goes, and when I say the world, I'm saying also the human world, the world of other people, the world of interacting with other people, because it's made it easy for human interactions to be superficial. I mean, that's always been a problem. If you even go back to Homer, it was a woman's beauty or sexual charisma or whatever it was that launched 1,000 ships and cost thousands of lives. But we have in the Glamour article that you mentioned, the old one
Yeah.
from I talk about a distinction that the great philosopher Arthur Danto makes.
Mm-hmm.
And he talks about manifesting a self and expressing a self.
Mm-hmm.
And, he says that one manifests a self, as I recall, he says it this way, by living in the world the way you find it, the way one finds it. And so you don't have any responsibility for creating it. Whereas an expression of itself, so manifestation of the self is clearly determined by, you're projecting yourself as one who lives in the actual world. In the other case, it's a person who is projecting the world as they see it.
Right.
Or as they imagine it, and it's much more interesting, when you find people like that. And you can see it in certain artists who manifest a world as they find it. They're appealing, they tend to be commercially successful. Sometimes some of them produce works that are incredibly expensive. But expressing a world has to do with something, and manifesting a world, they're very different. So when you express a world, you're, in a sense, you're expressing a self that is original.
Yeah.
Not as dependent upon that. So there's something, I think it's partly that there's a kind of originality that we sense, but that we can't describe conclusively.
Right.
That makes sense.
Yeah, it does. It's, I keep thinking that, as this might be interesting for your book as well. So there's sort of a cultural feedback to these characteristics, right? And they sort of circular in the sense that the culture shapes it, and the person shapes the culture. It goes on and on like that.
Yes.
And the end point of that is highly uncertain, right? You can't really predict what's going to happen. And so at any point in time, you say, I take a cross section of the culture and I look at these characteristics of society or individuals in it. And every time I do that, I'm going to find different answers. And like you say, I think when those changes are really fast, it becomes really difficult to live in, almost.
Well, it does. To live, I think, with an authenticity. I think that's one of the problems that we have in grasping and really appreciating the aesthetic properties of persons, and particularly things like glamour, true glamour, because it does require kind of probing within, oneself, perceiving differently, interacting differently. But yes, you're right. Certainly expressing a self is going to be, in part determined by the interaction with the culture. The way the self one expresses, say you have a glamorous person who's expressing a self that we somehow intuitively know is interesting, or, that's where the mystery comes in. And, obviously it's going to be expressed differently in different societies.
Right.
Just with language. Some people have a fluency with language or a dexterity with language that is awe-inspiring. But that's going to be partly the way it's expressed, partly determined by the language they speak, the culture in which they live, their native language, perhaps as it's as it takes root in another culture, you know, in the person who sees the world with complexity because of the complexity of their linguistic resources. But so some of these things are determined by culture and where one is rooted in culture and history.
Yeah.
And some of it, but the point is that there's a certain kind of, imaginative originality that makes you fascinated by a person. And it's not based upon these, the physicality or the costume, the mask.
Mm. Yeah, I see also, Carol, correct me if I'm wrong, I see a connection to materialism too, right? So the more material your objective function is, the more you're attracted to it, the more you're going to focus on sort of attention to yourself and attention to the objects, as opposed to attention to the content of the craft, right, of the person.
Yes.
And so there is a connection there too, and we can measure that.
In what way?
So materialism, there should be metrics, we could look at, right? So we could ask people how they, given 10 different things, how do you prioritize those 10 things? And I would imagine it will change over time.
Yes, of course they would. I agree with that. But I think though that this problem or this phenomenon that I'm discussing,
yeah,
we can actually trace it back to Socrates. In fact, I think that perhaps I may have gotten this idea partly from that and partly from some of the reading I do in psychoanalysis, which I take seriously.
Yeah.
But Socrates was this person who he definitely had charisma, and he definitely had a sort of glamour to him, although he was notoriously ugly, by the way. And he was poor, and yet here he was one of the most powerful people in Athens. He was so powerful that they had to put him to death. His political foes.
Yeah.
And what is it that people found so enticing about him? Not just his philosophical dialogue. And when I talk about Socrates, I should say I'm talking about the Socrates we find in Plato, because he didn't write anything. We don't know that much about him. We just have 3 different writers who have written about him, and they all give us a different Socrates. So, of people who knew him, Xenophon and Aristophanes, and then there's Plato.
Yeah.
So the Platonic Socrates is the most complex and the most interesting, and had perhaps the most intricate and complex philosophical picture of the world, and certainly of the human world. But as you know, he was noted for his method, and his method could be very vicious. People speak of it with such admiration and loftiness, but he liked to humiliate people, and and the more publicly, the better. But he was, but clearly he wanted to show people the dangers, as you would say, the dangers of ignorance. And his notion of ignorance was not just not knowing facts. He thought that information was quite different from real intelligence or what one might call wisdom. It's translated as such, but he does mean something quite different. But he's speaking about something that's difficult to acquire, but certainly possible. But so here he was in this culture that virtually worshipped physical beauty. And he did not even come close to meeting the standards of his culture.
Right.
And they also liked wealth, even though the democracy in principle was an attempt to equalize the classes, to level the hierarchy, hierarchical structure that had existed prior to that. It was an incredible experiment, if you think about it, wasn't it, at that time? I guess it has been at any time. But it's, and I know that you're interested in the democracy from your blog, that, so here he was, and people sought him out, some of the most handsome men in Athens. And I say this not because, and they were heterosexual for the most part, but the customs of that day were very different. This is always one of the first things my students want to know when I'm trying to talk about theoretical matters in Greek philosophy. Well, were they all gay? Well, no, it's not that, but that was just part of the sort of cultural, social development of a male, which was different from a female child. At a certain age, they were taken under the wing or sort of linked up with someone who was a little more mature. But they did have relationships with men. They weren't fully erotic in the sense that we think about them, but I'm not going to touch that here. We won't go there. And again, the literature on that is vast too, since I would say that goes back.
Yeah, I want to connect this to one of your articles, Carol.
Another one. Okay.
Yeah, so beauty is subjective. So you say, when we say that a poem or a painting is beautiful, we are making a value judgment. Many people insist that value judgments are simply a matter of subjective opinion because we find value in things that we find pleasurable or that serve our interests. Contrary to popular opinion, at least some judgments of beauty, despite being value judgments, you say are objectively true. Let's talk about that. Why do you think there is an objectivity to beauty?
Wow. Here we go. Well, I think that as one of the things that I think in here, actually, this is a Platonic concept that beauty is subjective. I think that, first of all, we can look across cultures and there are certain similarities, but that's not my bailiwick. I'm a philosopher, not an empirical researcher. But I also think that the concept of beauty, we couldn't even discuss it if it weren't something real. And also, I do think that there are aesthetic properties for a variety of reasons, complex reasons. And maybe you also read my rebuttal to the relativist there.
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
Yeah. So there are certain kinds of, however it's played out, there are certain kinds of things that we recognize immediately as self-evidently pleasing. And not that the pleasing is the same as the beautiful, and that goes back to the aesthetic properties of persons as well, just as we can see, sometimes we see a person's character as beautiful, which is different than, seeing an artwork as beautiful or something like that. But there's simply something self-evident about it. And I think that if we look to mathematics, as we were talking about before, that might be one of the best examples.
Yeah.
There's certain elegance, a certain interest, a certain variety and originality in some proofs. And I think that's true in logic as well, logical proofs. And in the Glamour article, as I recall, because as I said, that was a while ago, but as I recall, I talk about Anselm's ontological argument, which I think has a kind of glamour to it. And Wittgenstein, the philosopher Wittgenstein, was credited with describing as glamorous. He's thinking of a proof that had false glamour to him. Cantor's theorem, and he says it has a glamour that made. Well, he's quoted as having said that by a writer of fiction, though. But still, he was known to have said something like that. That it could bewitch people. There is something about a kind of variety and uniformity and tautness, elegance, conciseness that
Yeah.
we react to so intuitively. I mean, it's rational. I mean, that's how, as I said, if we go back to this idea about mathematics,
Right.
it's clear that
Yeah. So we value, sort of simplicity and elegance, right?
well,
There,
we
there,
do,
yeah.
yes,
There
yes.
is a neuroscience basis to this also. There was a hypothesis, Carol, that says the mind perceives beauty, whether it's mathematics or faces or whatever objects you want to think about, as a function of how much processing power it has to do. So the least amount of processing it needs to do,
Mm-hmm.
the more beautiful it will consider that to be.
Yes,
Uh,
it's actually
yeah,
that's a,
go
uh,
ahead.
no, I was thinking about that. It's clearly true in, again, in conceptual thinking, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it goes
When,
to math. It goes to, so that's why people used to think symmetry, right? I mean,
mhm.
symmetry is a characteristic, but more foundationally, it's basically the brain saying, yeah, I can figure this out very quickly. So I don't need to waste too many cycles of computing time.
Well, actually, symmetry is it's interesting because in Japanese aesthetics, um, asymmetry is valued.
That's
Symmetry
interesting.
is, yeah, symmetry is considered unimaginative, boring. What's
Okay.
interesting, no, and in fact, I'm one of the things that I've written about is a Japanese philosopher in the early 20th century who studied in France and went back to Japan, and he was an expert on Bergson.
Mm.
And he wrote about he draws an invidious comparison between the Japanese aesthetic and the French, or we might say European, Western European at that time,
Yeah.
precisely because there was no mystery to it, uh, and there was a kind of vulgarity and obviousness to it. And some might say the same about symmetry. So I don't know. I think that when we try to define it in these ways, in terms of, say, for example, symmetry, um, something that we don't have to process at great length, that that um, that's a cultural prejudice,
Mm.
and I do. I think, and I think that um, that there's something. I mean, yes, and I think that even I'm not sure about this. There's a whole field called neuroaesthetics.
Yeah.
Perhaps you're familiar with, and is it more appealing because we can process it easily, or is it more appealing because we recognize so clearly a certain elegance in a theory or even in something that's asymmetrical, but something that's an essay that's written with the most information but with the fewest words.
Mm. I don't know much about it, Carol. So my
So that would be,
yeah, my intuition would be to say, the objective functions humans have remain to be somewhat crude for 50,000 years. It hasn't really
mhm.
changed. It needs a certain amount of energy. It needs to perpetuate its genes. It has given an allotment of time. And so I don't believe humans have changed much. So from a brain perspective, I would think that it's more about mechanics rather than
Well,
anything else. Yeah.
well, may I ask you this?
Yeah.
Do you think that because something is valued widely or appreciated widely and easily, that it has more aesthetic value than something that isn't?
Yeah. So I was thinking about this, Carol. So suppose I am interested in an object, let's say, for whatever reason, right? Not beauty per se, but I'm just interested in it. Maybe it's
Mhm.
the color, maybe it's the shape, whatever it is. And then I say, I'm going to study it. At that point, I'm kind of kicking off a feedback loop that ultimately might end up with the concept of beauty in my mind, right? And
Mhm.
so maybe I start observing a picture, a painting, just because I'm just making this up, just because I was interested in the frame,
Yes.
and then I started looking at it, and then I started, thinking that it's beautiful, right? So is it sort of a reinforcing mechanism that is not just a one act condition, but really something that goes back and forth, ultimately resulting in this idea of beauty?
Well, yes, I think so. There's what is called in philosophy of science a looping effect.
Yeah.
But it's the reason I ask you, and I think it's you've asked some provocative questions, and perhaps I dodged the question about beauty, but you were saying before when we were talking about glamour, you asked me whether I thought that that the current the pace of current society
Yeah.
was making glamour disappear. But the fact that we can perceive something quickly, I mean,
Mhm.
it would seem to suggest then was would make it harder for us to have genuine appreciation of something, and I would say intellectually or aesthetically.
Right.
And that was what you seemed to be suggesting as well.
That
So,
Yeah. So that has societal implications, right? So if that is true, if everything is getting sped up, and by definition you need more time, I think that's what you're saying. You need more time to really appreciate, let's say, beauty. Then at some point you won't have that time, and hence you might actually lose the concept of beauty at some point in the future.
well, you can certainly, it certainly becomes diluted and perhaps vulgarized,
Right.
which again has probably happened in every society because you're right. There's some things that are just easier to think about, to look at. Um, there are things that when you're first learning them, if you really want to understand them, it can take the time it takes is just overwhelming. It consumes, vast hours of your day.
Mm.
But then once you get it, it doesn't take a lot of time.
Right.
And I'm thinking here of things like, advanced logic that, or mathematics, sciences, the kind of thing that you do um, that is in a different area.
that,
Um,
that that's easy.
that's easy. Oh,
It's actually charisma, glamour, beauty. Those types of things are much more difficult, I believe, to understand, to define, to analyze, and that makes it really interesting to study. Carol, I want to jump into one other area that I think you're working on as we speak, and that is psychoanalysis, imagination, and imaginative resistance.
oh, okay. Okay.
And I find that really interesting as well. That so in a common man's terms, if you are reading a horror novel, at some point your brain stops and says, I want to stop this and get out of it, right? So sort of resisting the idea that you can enter an imaginative world and participate or really internalize that. And that happens. So there are some reasons why that happens, right?
I think so. Although I think that in some cases, we get so lost in a world, regardless of its horrors
Yeah.
or um,
Or you could get
moral
conditioned.
atrocities, you can get conditioned. But if
Yeah.
something is so beautifully constructed or compelling, uh, you become so absorbed that you don't break from it imaginatively. You're so immersed in it with your imagination. Um, so I think that there are different reasons, but yes, I do think that people resist certain things, both within their own psyches and outside of their psyches. And, you know, this goes back to something you wrote about with ignorance. No, I do think it's true, because it's very easy to turn away from, to resist in our moral imaginations, things that happen. We're seeing it right now with this pandemic. Certain, you know, I think there's certain moral atrocities that are committed in healthcare, and not just with the pandemic, I should say, in other ways too, like when when someone's will is dismissed as unimportant.
Yes.
As, you know, a healthcare professional might want to protect themselves. I mean, there's terrible suffering that goes on for people at the hands of others, not just in healthcare, but I'm thinking about the pandemic, and, you know, the person who without the mask, who rides the bus, and then that would be just one example. But sometimes it's much easier to shut off, to just hear it intellectually, and close our minds to it, not engage our moral imagination, which is a form of imagination. And one of the things I talked about in that article, that not at length, but I think that it's true, is that what's considered egregious in one culture might not in another. So a work might, you know, and not just because of, not that it means it's right, but it's just that people become inured to things, you know.
Yeah, I was, sort of thinking, I was thinking in terms of an individual, but this is actually more broadly applicable for society and culture too.
Yes.
I was thinking, is an individual sort of an accumulation of repressed thoughts, a vast collection of experiences from the past, repressed into the unconscious container, let's say. And then, the individual basically let out a small part of it into the open for the world to see. That's what the world believes the individual is. But really, you're just seeing the tip of the iceberg. Now, you could actually think about this in the societal context, right? So the society is also an accumulation of repressed thoughts, and what measurements we can take in public is really a small part of it, I think.
That's fascinating, Gil, and I think that you're absolutely right. That's a very good analogy about the way we construct our historical memory, if that's what you're talking about. The way we construct our cultural identities. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, it's memories, but it's also from your article. I was thinking about repressed thoughts, meaning I am filing away information in the unconscious container. Now, it is it's not an intentional activity, but it's a sort of a mechanistic activity.
Right.
Yes. And it is there. It's all there. From from a hardware perspective, we know once it gets into the long-term memory, it's not going to escape from it.
Mm-hmm.
And so an individual then is what we see of an individual is really a very small part of that, right?
Yes.
There's huge amount of I don't know what's the right term for that, baggage there, so to speak, right? So does society in many ways, right? So I don't know, how to think about this, but it has policy implications. You talked about elections and democracy. Yeah, the systems that we have devised, really taking measurements of the obvious, measurements of what the world can see. If we believe that it's only a small part of what we are about, then those measurements can really be representative or what we all believe.
I think you're right. That's right. It can't be, because of course culture and cultures have constructed identities just as human beings do. For example, we're seeing now with these statues and these monuments that are being destroyed, not just in this country, but elsewhere, to people who were recognized now as, in some way, moral abominations. You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
That's coming down and so forth.
Yeah.
And that's almost a kind of,
Yeah.
you might say it's analogous to, not really the same as, but it's analogous to a psychoanalytic breakthrough in an individual. Is that what you mean?
That's exactly what I mean. Yeah. So that's a very good example. And so would you say, Carol, from your expertise then, when you have these types of, let's call it revolution, I don't know what the right term might be, society sort of letting out of its, let's call it repressed memories and thoughts, those would be sort of sudden, right, as we have seen most recently.
Mm-hmm.
And so, we think about policy more from a gradual perspective, to make things better. But if you have these types of events, then you can really have the status quo as designed, I think.
No, that's right. That's right. We have to see it as a dynamic entity.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Carol, we could go on for hours on this. But yeah, thanks so much for spending time with me. And
my pleasure.
yeah, good luck with your research. And I would love to read your book when it comes out. What is it called again?
Well, right now, that's being negotiated.
Okay.
But it's probably going to talk about something like, the publisher wants it to be mainly titled about glamour, it might just be called True Glamour or something like that. Okay. But I'm not sure yet. I wanted initially a different title, or True Glamour and Personhood or something like that. Yeah. Because there's a lot of detail about, I have one chapter in which there's a great deal of detail about personhood and why the aesthetics of persons are so different than the aesthetics of anything else. So, but yes, I would love to talk with you more sometime, Gil. And I so appreciate your having invited me.
Absolutely.
Really, it's a compliment. So.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Carol. Keep safe.
Yes, you too, Gil.
Thank you. Bye.
Be well. Bye-bye.